and lives to tell about it.
These two clips might look like they're from completely different games, yet they're actually both from the exact same series. I reviewed Saints Row 2 a few months ago, and while it had its flaws, the lively characters, wonderful open world, and impressive balancing of tones made for a very enjoyable experience, as well as one which had enough of a unique style to stand out from the other, more famous open world crime series. However, comparisons to Grand Theft Auto were inevitably made as this series was first coming out. So for the next two sequels, Volition would go for increasing magnitudes of wackiness so as to stand further apart from Rockstar's series. And while I was aware going into this series that it went through an identity crisis, I was still very much caught off guard when booting up Saints Row the Third for the first time a week after getting my review of its predecessor up and being greeted with this. Wow. What's most interesting about Saints Row the Third is, in essence, it's got the exact same plot as the last game. Take down numerous gangs and corporations to seize control of a city. But because of this drastic shift into more comedic territory with this murderous street gang now media superstars, it feels like a completely different plot. Sure, you could interpret this as the series keeping itself fresh, but the last game had such an excellent mix of engaging drama and memorable craziness, bolstering one coming off the other, that this shift didn't really work for me in comparison. It suffers the same issue as No More Heroes 3, whereby being a full-blown in-your-face wacky parody without a grounded edge to be juxtaposed against meant I found myself desensitized to the craziness very quickly. This game throws a lot of insane scenarios at you, yet somehow I was never caught off guard by any of them. As for the rest of the story, I was disappointed to find that the characters lacked the distinctive dynamics which made them so entertaining to watch in the last game, and many of the new additions feel quite thin in their characterization, defined by only a single trait or gag. Take Zemos for example, who is a pimp with an auto-tuned voice box who sings his lines like he was the goat from Hoodwinked.
I would shake your hands, but them floors were a little sticky, if you know what I'm saying.
That's basically all there is to him, and like many of the supporting characters, he just sort of comes and goes throughout the story, outright disappearing before the end. They're not very interesting or funny, and the rival gangs are incredibly forgettable. Also, after my first couple of sessions with the game, I wound up not playing it for a while to focus on a couple of other projects, and by the time I came back, I had completely forgotten Johnny Gat, one of the main characters in this whole series, gets killed off. This story simply goes in one ear and right out the other, and the awkward looking and moving character models in this remaster only further highlight how disjointed this plot feels, although the rest of the updated visuals are very nice. But I do have to concede that in the moment, the characters are entertaining enough, despite being nowhere near as well realized as in the previous game, and the use of music at certain points can be really invigorating. Skydiving and infiltrating a penthouse set to Kanye West is a great moment, and playing I Need a Hero during the final mission made for a final push almost as thrilling as when the song was used in Shrek 2. Yeah, the subtitle for the third movie wasn't the only thing the Saints Row series nicked from DreamWorks. To be honest, the story is mildly enjoyable while you're experiencing it, but it doesn't leave much of an impression, and the new direction felt like a downgrade from what 2 was doing. And unfortunately, that just about sums up the entire game. There is fun to be had here. The driving and shooting is still very entertaining, and some of the more outlandish weapons can actually be very fun to use. I got some mindless entertainment out of this game, which is perfectly fine. But as a Saints Row sequel, there's too few improvements made from the last one, and it just feels really lacking in comparison. For starters, in my review for Saints Row 2, I mused that Stillwater was one of the best open worlds I'd ever had the pleasure of visiting, the sheer variety on display in each location making it a real treat to explore. This new map, Steelport, has absolutely none of that, consisting mostly of either generic city or suburb, which bleeds together in such an uninteresting, forgettable way. It's also incredibly bland. I felt little interest in going off the beaten track, and it suffers even more following up this awesomely diverse map which had such life and personality to it. Once I finished the story in the last game, I spent a good couple of hours exploring and partaking in the activities, but as soon as I beat the campaign here, I haven't felt like picking it up again. Speaking of the activities, respect is no longer needed to progress the story, instead working as a leveling up system enabling you to buy very nifty and useful upgrades to your health and weapon power, ammo, etc. I like getting access to more upgrades the further you progress, but because it now renders the activities as a purely optional undertaking, the story makes a point of dedicating missions to trying out an activity. This didn't really work for me because it robs the incentive to discover them in the open world, it slams the story pacing to a halt for a few missions of filler, which to be fair the last game had with the Stronghold, and they're simply not quite as entertaining this go around. For an overall wackier game, why did they tone down the physics for the insurance fraud minigame? And because this is an overall wackier game, the novelty of having these crazy side games is greatly reduced. I wasn't interested in playing them beyond what was required, and so the game ends up being mostly a gunplay and driving experience. But like I said, those aspects are decent enough. I loved the new addition of being able to madly leap straight into the driver's seat, and while some of the vehicles are either a little too stiff or slippery to control with confidence, driving close to vehicles for respect is still fun, and the more outlandish air vehicles are quite enjoyable to pilot too. And I do appreciate that the car shooting sections, which could be a real bother in the last game, now generally have you as a passenger shooting while an NPC drives. Unfortunately, these sections generally feel overlong and tedious. I was relieved to find out this mission was formerly DLC and optional because this whole bit goes on for a good 5 minutes, probably longer if the car didn't keep getting blown up. There's a greater emphasis on on-rail sections which often dragged on. Certain shooting sections do feel more exhausting to play through than they ought to, especially when the stages seemingly weren't designed with the lack of a cover system in mind. But after taking a break from the game for a week, I came back to it rejuvenated and was able to have some fun with it for the last few hours, probably more than I would have done if I just kept plowing through. Judged on its own, it's a fine open-world action game, but in context of the series it's a part of, it's very forgettable, removes a lot of the uniquities which made 2 stand out, and can feel generic in spite of its rambunctious personality. It's an odd one, because despite critiquing it heavily, I sort of enjoyed it in parts, at least enough to reach the end and to jump into its follow-up soon after finishing it. And speaking of its follow-up, of all the minor pleasures one could get from using a time machine, going back to 2006 when the first Saints Row released and showing off the superpowered alien invasion antics the series had in store years later would be high on my list. But honestly, after the third, the route this game goes down didn't feel particularly shocking, even though this one really goes off the rails. The Saints are running the White House, aliens blow up the Earth, and you spend most of the game in a simulation with all these crazy powers. If it weren't for the references to the previous entries, this would feel completely detached from the series' roots. And you know what? That's exactly why I preferred this one to 3. I mean, if you're gonna jump the shark, then you might as well upgrade the super jump to maximum capacity and leap over the damn thing. This is beyond comparison to the, let's say, orange-tinted half of the series, where the third was still attempting to stay true to its roots, although that's a stretch. And thus, it's a lot easier to enjoy this one on its own merits. The story, while still not great, at least fully commits to this over-the-top style for a more consistent stream of outlandish moments. And it's more memorable than the last game because the gang dynamic is able to shine through a bit more. The characters don't just come and go like in the last game, and everyone gets enough screen time to make an impression. For comparison, Smokey and the Bandit is one of my favourite movies, largely because of the wonderful charisma Burt Reynolds brings to it. So his cameo in Saints Row the Third should have felt much cooler than it actually did, but he only pops up for a single mission and is only really there for the novelty of having
Burt fucking Reynolds?
as the mayor. Keith David playing Keith David in Saints Row 4 isn't just a quick gag, although the They Live segment does feel too random and forced. He is actually a recurring and entertaining presence who gets several fun jokes made out of the fact he's performed in the series before.
You sound just like Julius. He was right.
Where Saints Row 4 really comes into its own though is with the addition of superpowers. While the controls don't allow you to be as confident in landing comfortably or timing jumps off roofs and runs as you'd like, traversal with a combination of the sprint, jump and glide along with all the other unlockable moves is not only really fun, but the faster pace of free roaming makes the blandness of Steelport a non-issue now you're mostly hopping from rooftop to rooftop. And the clusters which are used to upgrade your superpowers are surprisingly addictive to collect. It's easy to find yourself going off the beaten track to collect a dozen on the way to an objective. Superpowers are fun to use in the fights too, with several unique and inventive options which are balanced out enough with the number of enemies you face as well as their need to charge up so as not to make things too easy. But bizarrely enough, many of the story missions strip away your superpowers to participate in fairly ordinary combat encounters. I guess the developers were concerned that you would be overpowered, but at least we got some very unique scenarios to play through. Unfortunately, these missions outstay their welcome and the game still finds itself feeling rather repetitive. Some of them just go on, and by the time they'd end, I'd long had more than enough of them. It doesn't help matters that health no longer regenerates, now requiring you to collect pickups from killed NPCs. For this style of frantic gameplay, this is a bit of a downgrade and adds an unnecessary layer of stress to the proceedings as you desperately try to collect the pickups while being shot at, losing more health. While I appreciate the replay value added into the open world with side missions, I really had no interest in trying them out because the campaign offered more than enough action, thank you very much. No, what I enjoyed about this game was simply free roaming the city with a hugely entertaining moveset. These optional towers are very fun to ascend, and the activities are a big improvement over the last game despite suffering from the forced into the campaign issue. There's a bit more variety, and the physics in Fraud are absolute insanity. I had a blast playing it. So yeah, I like Saints Row 4. While I certainly prefer 2 and would have liked to have seen another game like it, or, a port of the Xbox 360 exclusive original, I do think this works in its own bizarre way. Would I be as positive towards it if I had played these games as they came out and gradually experienced its identity crisis? Possibly not, but having experienced this series over the last few months, and in particular these two Steelport set entries, this freshened things up by embracing the madness approach where the third only went so far and came off as a bit bland as a result. And this upcoming reboot seems to have shifted this series' style again. Clearly, this is a very inconsistent franchise, but I guess my takeaway from its last two main entries thus far, and even two, is however you want to stylize the game, be audacious with it. It's left us with an oddball collection for sure, but one which can be quite a lot of fun when it takes its tone to the absolute extreme. Oh, and one last thing. It's befuddling to me that this 2020 remaster has excessive and lengthy loading times which aren't prevalent in the earlier released games and ports. Huh? And for goodness sake, stop adding the neck tattoo back after the previous session where I had it removed! At least I could play through Saints Row 4 with a cleansed body. That sounds a bit weird. Just end the video.